Grant, architect of ambition, not of sentiment, stared at the email. The subject line, Estate of Eleanor Vance, felt like an errant spam filter miss. He'd barely known his great-aunt, a woman he remembered only as a distant, reclusive figure who sent scratchy wool sweaters for Christmas. He certainly hadn't expected to inherit anything beyond a few antique porcelain figurines he'd promptly donate. But the attached PDF outlined the transfer of a property. Not a quaint cottage, not a country estate, but an entire apartment building. The Blackwood. The name itself, emblazoned in a stark, archaic font on the digital deed, held a certain somber weight. Grant scrolled down, his eyes scanning for the address, then the valuation. The numbers, though preliminary, made his breath catch. Dilapidated or not, this was prime real estate. That was the only thought that mattered. He dismissed the lawyer's cautionary tone during their brief call. A building of significant historical character, the lawyer had droned, and a rather unique past. Grant had nodded, feigning attention while mentally calculating demolition costs versus renovation estimates. Unique past meant old, probably crumbling, and definitely a money pit if not handled correctly. But handled correctly meant profit. The drive to the Blackwood was longer than he anticipated, taking him through forgotten stretches of the city where brick facades gave way to skeletal trees and neglected storefronts. He passed a turnoff sign for the coast, a faded brown marker pointing towards an abandoned lighthouse. A flicker of an old memory, a summer trip with a childhood friend, a dare to climb the rusted stairs, the salt-laced wind whipping his hair. He'd been a different person then, less concerned with the precise angles of a structural beam, more with the wild expanse of the ocean. He shook his head, pushing the image aside. Sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford. His focus was on the present, on the acquisition ahead. Finally, the GPS announced his arrival. Grant slowed the car, then stopped. The Blackwood rose before him, a monolithic slab of dark stone and tarnished brick, looming over its overgrown lot like a forgotten sentinel. It wasn't merely old, it was ancient, burdened by years of neglect. The once grand entrance was a gaping maw of splintered wood and corroded ironwork, flanked by thickets of thorny bushes that clawed at the lower windows. Paint peeled from the window frames like sunburnt skin, revealing the grimy wood beneath. Many panes were shattered, others opaque with accumulated grime. A chill, despite the mild afternoon, seemed to emanate from its very core. A real fixer-upper. He felt a flicker of something unidentifiable, a prickle on the back of his neck, but he chalked it up to the sudden drop in temperature and the sheer scale of the decay. He was an architect, accustomed to seeing potential beneath blight. This was merely a challenge, a particularly lucrative one. He retrieved the heavy brass key from his briefcase, a relic the lawyer had handed over with a strange, almost relieved expression. The lock groaned in protest, a metallic shriek that echoed off the building's unyielding walls. The massive door, heavy as a tombstone, swung inward with a drawn-out sigh, disturbing a cloud of dust that shimmered in the weak light. The air inside was stagnant, thick with the scent of damp earth, mildew, and something else. Something indescribably old, like dried flowers pressed between forgotten pages, or perhaps the metallic tang of stagnant water. Grant stepped over the threshold, his polished shoes crunching on grit and plaster fragments. Peeling wallpaper, once a rich crimson, hung in strips like tattered flags. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light filtering through the grimy upper windows, creating an almost hallucinatory effect. He told himself it was just the wind, rattling loose panes somewhere high above. "Hello?" he called out, his voice swallowed by the vastness. He knew there were supposed to be a few remaining tenants, but the place felt utterly deserted. He walked further in, his footsteps echoing unnervingly. He paused, tilting his head. A faint, rhythmic scratching, like nails on wood coming from somewhere above? He waited, straining his ears. Just the building settling, he decided. He pulled out his phone, snapping photos, already envisioning the digital renderings, the modern lines he'd impose on this decaying husk. He moved through the ground floor, noting water damage, crumbling cornices, the skeletal remains of what might have been a concierge desk. He found himself walking more slowly, listening more intently, despite his resolve. But the potential profit dwarfed the inherent creepiness. He saw the polished floors, the minimalist aesthetic, the high-end finishes. And that was all that mattered. He dismissed it as a passing truck, though the street outside had been utterly still. He clenched his jaw, determined. This building was an investment, nothing more. He would strip away its past, modernize its bones, and move on. He would not let its unique character stand in his way. He would not let it touch him. The Blackwood loomed, not with the expected grandeur of a historically significant structure, but with a weary, almost defiant slump. He squinted against the weak morning sun, its rays failing to penetrate the grimy windows. The facade, once a testament to turn-of-the-century ambition, now sagged, its ornate stonework chipped, its wrought iron balconies rusted into skeletal lacework. He noted the missing slate tiles on the mansard roof, the cracked lintels above the ground floor shops, long since boarded up. A money pit, he thought, his architect's eye already calculating the extensive repairs, the permits, the structural assessments. But also, a gold mine, if he could flip it fast enough. The heavy oak front door, marred by decades of neglect and graffiti, groaned open with a sound like a forgotten beast stirring. Grant pulled out his notebook, his pen poised, ready to catalog the building's failings. The grand foyer, meant to impress, was a sepia-toned nightmare of peeling wallpaper and cracked marble. A single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe at the edges of his vision. "You must be the new owner," a voice rasped from the gloom. He startled, his hand tightening on his pen. A figure emerged from behind a dusty reception desk, a man whose clothes seemed to have been slept in for weeks. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes a startling, watery blue. This was the building's caretaker, Grant surmised, the one mentioned in the inheritance papers. He said, extending a hand that the caretaker ignored. "Grant, I'm here to assess the property." The caretaker merely nodded, his gaze lingering on his face a beat too long. "She kept it, lived in it, most of it." His voice was a dry whisper. "The building has its ways." Grant dismissed the cryptic comment as the ramblings of an old man too long in the same musty place. He'll need access to all floors, the basement, the roof. "Do you have blueprints?" "Blueprints are complicated," the caretaker murmured, turning to shuffle towards a dark corridor. Some of the residents are still here. The floorboards creaked under Grant's sensible shoes, a chorus of complaints. Drafty. He noted it down. As they passed a closed door, he heard a faint scratching from within, like fingernails dragging across wood. Then a sigh. "Just the resident," the caretaker said, without turning, as if reading his mind. "She hears things." They ascended a wide, curving staircase, its once lustrous banister now grimy and sticky to the touch. He found himself wishing he were somewhere else entirely, perhaps on a rugged coastal cliff, watching the waves crash against an abandoned lighthouse. The salt spray a sharp, clean contrast to this suffocating air. On the third floor, a door creaked open as they approached. A woman, her hair a wild silver halo, peered out, his eyes wide and unfocused, fixed on Grant. They always forget. She clutched a porcelain doll to her chest, its painted smile chipped. He waits for the memories. He forced a tight smile. "He likes the attention," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "Makes him stronger." She retreated, the door clicking shut with an unnerving finality. Eccentric, Grant muttered to the caretaker, scribbling, "Tenant issues, potential eviction challenges." In his notebook, he attributed her strange words to senility, a mind lost in the building's decaying grandeur. As they continued their survey, a peculiar pattern began to emerge. Flickering lights in empty rooms, the distinct scent of lilies in a hallway where no flowers grew, a sudden, almost imperceptible shift in the air pressure that made his ears pop. He blamed it on the poor wiring, the damp, his own exhaustion. It's an old structure, prone to all sorts of quirks. He was an architect, grounded in logic and physics. There was always a rational explanation. Yet, a subtle unease began to prick at him, a persistent sliver beneath the surface of his professional detachment. Not just physically, but as if burdened by a profound, unshakable sorrow. He found himself checking his watch more frequently, eager to finish his initial assessment. The prospect of quick profit, once so clear, now felt tinged with something less tangible, something he couldn't quite put his finger on, but which made the hairs on his arms rise. The Blackwood wasn't just old. It felt aware. The woman's words, heavy with an unsettling implication, had merely solidified he's resolve. He likes the attention. A ridiculous notion, born of an old building and an isolated mind. He dismissed it as the ramblings of someone unaccustomed to the sharp edges of the city, of progress. The she wasn't a personality. It was an investment, a structure ripe for exploitation. His mind raced with figures, with renovation plans, with the satisfying click of a sale. Determination was a shield against the creeping unease, a bulwark against the building's strange hum. He spent the next few days in a blur of activity, fueled by lukewarm coffee and an unwavering focus the bottom line. He moved through the building, a clipboard in hand, assessing damage, marking out potential layouts. The dust motes danced in the sparse sunlight that pierced the grimy windows, illuminating the forgotten corners of the Blackwood. He found himself drawn to the deeper, less frequented parts of the building. The disused storage rooms in Thesement, the sealed-off attic space. He needed to understand every inch of the property he now owned. One afternoon, prying open a warped door in the Hest corner of the herd floor, an apartment that looked like it had been abandoned mid-sentence decades ago, he noticed a faint discoloration on a wall, hidden behind a collapsed bookshelf. Curious, he ran his hand over the plaster, feeling a subtle unevenness. He found a loose seam, almost invisible, and with a grunt, leveraged a crowbar into the gap. The plasterboard gave way with a dry crackle, revealing a shallow cavity. Inside, nestled in the ethetid dust and cobwebs, was a small, tarnished metal box. Grant pulled it out, the ancient grime flaking onto his fingers. He knelt, brushing away the debris, and found the clasp. It was rusted, but with a fag, it sprung open with a Sarah-testing groan. The box contained a small trove, a sheaf of yellowed letters tied with a ball ribbon, a few sepia-toned photographs, and a leather-bound journal. The air around him suddenly felt thicker, carrying the scent of dried paper and something else. Something indefinable, like old regret. He picked up the journal first. Its cover was smooth, worn from countless touches, the pages brittle. He opened it carefully, the faint, spidery script a testament to a life long past. The entries spoke of a time when the he was vibrant. Yet even then, there were undertones of unease. The chill that settles in the east wing, even thermer. The whispers from the ventilation shafts. A distinct, icy draft snaked around his ankles, despite the closed windows. He shivered, attributing it to the building's poor insulation. He focused back the journal, flipping a page. A faded photograph slipped out, depicting a stark, wind-swept coastline. Dominating the image was an abandoned lighthouse, its white paint peeling, its lantern housing dark and empty like a vacant eye. Beside it, A small, handwritten note. Thee back. Our last hope. Gone. He heard it then. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, like rustling silk just behind his ear. His heart gave a slight, unwelcome lurch. He swallowed, telling himself it was the old building settling, the wind. He carried the box of discoveries to his own temporary apartment, the ground floor, intending to review them later. As he descended the main staircase, he encountered the elderly historian, a man whose glasses perpetually seemed to be sliding down his nose, perched precariously on a wooden bench in the communal hallway, engrossed a massive, leather-bound book. "Morning, Grant," the historian said. Without looking up, his voice raspy. "Busy tearing down the past, are we?" He stopped, the box tucked under his arm, just clearing out some forgotten corners. He was found some interesting relics. He gestured vaguely with the box. The historian finally looked up, his eyes, magnified by thick lenses, fixed the box. A knowing, almost mournful expression settled on his face. Ah. The building is quite good at keeping its secrets, but eventually, it shares them. An audience. He closed his book with a soft thud. "Yo, Grant, this place has an unhappy history. More than just faded grandeur." He felt a prickle of irritation. Every old building has stories. Indeed, like a breath held too long, makes him stronger. He tried to rationalize it away, but the historian's conviction was unsettling. "Are you suggesting the building itself consumes people?" His voice tighter than he intended. The historian merely smiled, a thin, humorless line. Grantham suggesting the Blackwood has a very long memory and a very particular hunger. He stood slowly, adjusting his glasses. "Be careful what you dig up, Some things are better left buried." He shuffled off, disappearing into his apartment, leaving Grant alone in the suddenly too quiet hallway. As he tried to make sense of the journal thieves, the disturbances intensified. The faint rustling became a distinct drag, as if something heavy were being pulled across the floor in the apartment above him. Then, the rap on his door, not firm, but insistent, like a bony knuckle. He froze, his hand hovering over the journal. He knew he was the only one on this floor. He told himself it was the old pipes, the settling wood. The she wasn't just an investment, and it was starting to remember him. Grant could still feel the historian's gaze, a prickle on his neck that lingered long after he'd left the cluttered office. "Consumes people." The words echoed, a low, unsettling hum beneath the surface of his thoughts. He dismissed it, of course. Superstition, a quaint, if disturbing narrative woven around an old structure. His ambition, however, felt less steady, a tremor in the foundation of his carefully construct theans. Back at Blackwood, the building seemed to watch him with a new intensity. He'd try a focus on thie prints spread across a drafting table in what used to be a ground floor parlor, but his eyes kept drifting to the ornate plaster, the thie ling, the shadows gathering in the corners. They were a shift in the pattern, a subtle thiorshan in the familiar floral motte, that blinked, and it resolved back Theight's original symmetrical form. Just fatigue, he told himself, the stress of the historian's eccentric, the getting to him. That night, sleep offered no escape. He dreamt of corridors twisting endlessly, not the elegant, if decaying hallways of the she, but something Mothe-Rinthine, impossible. Walls pulsed with a faint, sickly luminescence, revealinangs that writhed and shifted, depicting faces caught in silent screams. He saw a hand, long and skeletal, reaching from a gap in a stone wall, its fingertips brushing against a faded tapestry. The clock on his phone glowed 3:47 a.m. The following days blurred into a disorienting cycle. The dreams continued, growing more vivid, more intrusive. He saw brief, fleeting images in his waking hours. A flash of a grotesque gargoyle where a simple cornice should be, a column twisting into something organic and segmented, like an insect's leg, before snapping back to its plain, fluted design. They felt borrowed, thrust upon him, detailed and specific in their unsettling architecture. He found himself sketching them, almost compulsively, on the gins of his renovation plans. A spire that stared the sky with malevolent intent, a window that gaped like a mouth filled with jagged teeth. He had teared the pages out, disgusted, but the images persisted in his mind's eye. One afternoon, seeking a reprieve from the building's pervasive quiet, he decided to check on feigning tenants. The young artist, a quiet woman named Chloe, had a studio on 3rd floor, her rent paid for months in advance, a detail that had previously suited his plans for a swift sale. He found her door ajar, a faint, sweet smell of oil paint and turpentine wafting into the hallway. He hesitated, then pushed the door open wider. Canvases leaned against every available surface, some finished, others still wet. Grant's gaze swept across the room, then snagged on a large piece propped on an easel near the window. It was a painting of Blackwood, unmistakably so, yet disthy, warped into something was a central tower, which in reality was merely a decorative cupola, rose impossibly high, its peak crowned with a series of sharp, jagged protrusions that clawed at thatted sky. The windows, usually elegant arched panes, were elongated and narrow, like eyes squinting in pain, some filled with an unnatural, sickly yellow light. But it was the details that truly unnerved him. The grotesque gargoyles he'd seen in his own fleeting vie belloise, now rendered in stark, unsettling detail, their stone faces contorted in silent, eternal agony. The columns along the facade twisted, not into flutes, but into segmented, chitinous forms, just as he'd sketched on his discarded notes. He stepped closer, his heart thrumming against his ribs. The young artist stood by a work table, her back to him, mixing a deep ochre on her palette. She didn't seem to notice his presence. He saw another painting, smaller, leaning against the wall. It depicted a hallway, impossible and vast, with a hand reaching from a fissure in the stone, the exact Iarome his dream. "Chloe?" he managed, his voice a dry rasp. She startled, dropping the let knife with a clatter. "What is this?" He gestured vaguely at the Isayan to the smaller painting. "These features that they always have been. The building." He was seeing them too. Not just seeing them, but feeling them, allowing them to manifest through her art. This wasn't a shared hallucination. It was something far more insidious. The building wasn't just influencing his mind. It was actively shaping the wastelands of those within its walls, twisting their reality. He didn't know where building, only that he needed to escape the pervasive sense of being watched, of being imprinted upon. He drove aimlessly until the familiar scent of salt and brine filled the air, the roar of the ocean a welcome, if brutal, sound. Betha whipped at his clothes, tearing at the edges of his resolve. The rhythmic crash of waves against the rocks below felt like a heartbeat, relentless and indifferent. He stared out the churning gray expanse of the sea, the vastness a stark contrast to the thickading confines of the She. Thelding. It wasn't just a dilapid structure. It was a hungry canvas, a living thing imposing its own horrific vision onto the minds of its inhabitants. And T-Building was not just its inheritor, but its newest conduit. He gripped the cold metal railing of the lighthouse's observation deck, his knuckles The entity wasn't just feeding on memories. It was feeding on perception, using its victims to paint itself back into existence, piece by terrifying piece. And he had seen its wasint, the image of the artist's frantic charcoal strokes, the faces thieing from the shadows of the paper, clung to Grant like a shroud. He'd set them too, those indistinct figures pressed against the periphery of his vision, the ones that whispered just beyond for his hold of hearing. But she, the artist, had given them form, had dragged them screaming from the building Histon depths. He was seeing them too. The building wasn't just influencing his mind, it was actively colonizing. It wasn't just the absence of faux buildings, the absence of a specific hum. A particular creak of floorboard was usually Anne building Arley risers. He found himself pausing outside Wasen 3B, a unit usually marked by the faint, comforting aroma of stale pipe tobacco and lavender. He remembered the resident, an elderly gentleman, Mr. Finch, who always left his newspaper folded neatly on the worn They runner each morning before heading out for his daily walk. Today, the runner was bare. Grant waited, a prickle of unease starting low in his spine. He tried to recall the man's face, his features, but they seemed to ripple the edges of his memory, like heat haze over asphalt. He could remember the pipe tobacco, the lavender, the precise way the newspaper was folded, but the man himself remained a blur. The Hisrintendant, a man whose face was a roadmap of weary resignation, was hunched over a ledger. "Excuse him," he began. Grant was wondering about Mr. He haven't seen him tarning. The superintendent slowly lifted his head, his eyes blinking with a confusion that felt too genuine. Grant He don't recall a Mr. Finch. His brow flew a network of deep lines. Is that a new tenant? Grant felt a jolt. No, he's been here for years. The one who always smells of pipe tobacco? The one who complains about the draft near the main entrance? The superintendent shook his head, a slow, deliberate movement. Apartment 3B has been vacant since old Mrs. He vaguely remembered her, a frail woman with a cane. Finch. He was as real as the chipped paint on the walls. The spoken to him just laic about the leaky faucet in his bathroom. He retreated, the superintendent's words echoing in his ears, battling with his own dissolving recollections. He pulled out the building's tenant ledger, a heavy, leather-bound book. He flipped through the pages, his fingerhizing names, dates. Not in the superintendent's memory. A franhised for confirmation seized buildings. Allie ran to Mrs. Albright's apartment, his knuckles rapping sharply on the heavy oath. The historian, her face usually of the sharp, inquisitive lines, answered with a rare tremor in her hand. "He, dear boy, is everything all right?" he asked, his gaze sweeping Atated face. "Have you seen him?" Her attention snapped to a flicker of recognition, then confusion. "Finch? Oh, the gentleman with the pipe. Why do you ask?" Her voice had a strained quality, like a violin string pulled too taut. "The superintendent says he doesn't exist. That 3B has been vacant for months." Grant spoke to him. His voice was tight, desperate. Ed to tell him stories about the old days, about the building before the war. He had a dog, a little terrier. Her voice trailed off, her gaze unfocused, as if she were trying to grasp a dream slipping through her fingers. But what was his name? Grant can't quite picture his face, Grant. It's like T building Ember, a name from a forgotten dream. A tear tracked down her wrinkled cheek. It's happening again, isn't it? Her voice was raw with fear. It wasn't a shared hallucination. It was a shared erasure. He needed to think, to breathe, to escape the suffocating walls of the B-Black Woodenly for a moment. He drove without conscious dethion. Tatey lights blurring was streaking ribbons of color. The need for open space, for something vast and undeniable, pulled him. Eventually, the road narrowed, the asphalt giving way to cracked pavement, then a gravel path, until he found himself parked near the desolate stretch of coastline. Looming against the bruised twilight sky, stark and skeletal, stood the abandoned lighthouse. Its brickwork was crumbling, its lantern room a shattered eye staring blankly out the restless ocean. The wind whipped around him, carrying to the relt and decay. The rhythmic roar of the waves crashing against the rocks was a dull, insistent thrum. Hethia's hand over the rough, cold stone of the lighthouse, feeling the grit and the years of neglect. But even though the she's tendrils seemed tach, nestled in a crevice of the lighthouse's base, half buried by wind-blown sand, he saw it. Of the tarnished silver, the fumbled with the clasp, and it sprang open with a faint click. Inside, on one side, was a Taito photograph. His face was indistinct, blurred by time and moya, but there was something familiar about the set of his jaw, the gentle curve of his smile. On the otade, etched the silver, were 3 initials, F.M., Mr. Unknown. The locket felt impossibly heavy in his palm, a tangible anchor to a memory that was actively being erased. This wasn't just a disserence. This was something more ancient, far more predatory. The Blackwood just taking lives. It was taking their very existence. And he was standing right in its hungry path. The locket, cool and heavy in Hihiskit, felt less like an object and more like a stone dropped into the quiet pool of his complacency. The quas dissum just offered the elderly resident the quick calculations of profit margins. They all felt just replaced by a cold, insistent hour. The ocean's roar, still echoing in his mind, had been a physical manifestation of a he so vast to ignore. This wasn't just a dilapidated building. It was an anchor to something that actively resisted memory, something that consumed it. The archivist, a stoic woman with spectacles perched on her nose, barely acknowledged him beyond a nod towards the microfiche hiss. Grant, uswas impatient with bureaucracy, felt a strange urgency now. He requested everything pertaining to the she be just specifically its earliest records. The initial find there mundane. Property transfers, tax assessments, building permits. The Blackwood instructed in the late 1800s, an ambitious project for its time, designed by a local firm. But as he scrolled through the digitized newspapers, a different narrative began to emerge. Faint whispers, buried in local columns from the turn of the century, mentioned unusual gatherings, the then newly constructed build, the hathi of associaf peculiar interests that held private functions, drawing curious, sometimes disapproving, glances from the wider community. His fingers, usually adept at textural software, felt clumsy navigating the ancient texts. He found mentions of residents moving in. Then, a few years later, their names vanishing from the social registers, sometimes with a brief, vague notice of relte or poor health. He cross-referenced these with property deeds. Many units, once sold, reverted to Thainal Developers Holding Company with alarming frequency. It was a pat the short tenancies and sud the chures, a revolving do found deemed too fast for a prestigious address. Then, a name surfaced repeatedly, not as an owner, but as a consulting architect on several air innovations. Elias Thorne. Grant typed was name into the archive's search engine. Thorne had been a brilliant, if eccentric, designer, known for his unconventional use of space and light. His early work was lauded. But then, around the time the she was gaining its notoriety for strange residents, Thorne's professional output dwindled. Newspaper articles, once full of praise, shifted to increasingly concerned tones. It was as if he'd simply ceased to exist. This wasn't just poor record-keeping. It was an active erasure. The Blackwood's original blueprints, which he'd previously dismissed as overly complex, suddenly took on a sinister cast. He recalled the peculiar non-Yukwaz angles in some of the older, sealed-off sections he'd glimpsed during his Wasal walkthrough. Deeper in the Artha, in a collection of local historical society pamphlets, he found a faded, almost crumbling map of the justy early 1900s. It marked the she, but also, surprisingly, a series of faint datha lines extending out towards the coast. One of these lines terminated at a small, crudely drawn icon that looked unmistakably like a lighthouse. Bathi it, in elegant looping script, was a single cryptic word. Vigil Theord resonated with the locket's silent weight. Grant felt a pull, an alphoundnetic compulsion, towards that distant coastal point. He left the musty A of the archives, the Senna-old paper clinging to his clothes, and drove. The way to the coastal roads, the air growing sharper, tasting of salt and brine. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with unspoken things. He found it eventually, jutting out from a desolate stretch of rocky shore. The abandoned lighthouse. Its white paint was peeling, revealing patches of damp gray stone beneath. The Arn Room, once a beacon, was a broken skeletal cage, glass long gone, exposed to the elements. The wind here was a mournful howl, whipping his hair, pressing Agthe his clothes. He felt small, exposed, standing the edge of a vast, indifferent ocean. He circled they of the light-found crunch of shells and pebbles under his boots, the only A besides the wind and the thentless crash of waves. There was no grand revelation here, no hidden entrance or ancient artifact lying in plain sight. Only the raw, unvarnished truth of decay and abandonment. Yet the air felt charged, heavy with a forgotten purpose. He looked back towards the distant city skyline, trying to pinpoint the Blackwood building, Blackwood luster of structures. This wasn't just a bouah. It was a hungry mouth, and the abandoned lighthouse was a silent, weather-beaten sentinel, guarding a secret that was slowly, inevitably consuming everything it touched. He was no longer just renovating a building. The locket, cool and heavy in Grant's Poa, felt less like an object and more like a stare-opt into the pool of his complacency. The casual dismissals he'd offered the elderly resident, the quick calculations of profit margins. They all felt hollow now, replaced by a just-stent dread. He had spent the previous evening poring over the Bilden Thayer's plans. A stia brittle, yellowed parchment spread across the desk in his temporary office within the She. A space, tucked away in the deepest part high's foundation, marked with a peculiar, almost deliberate blankness. Not a structural void, but an excised thea as if the architect of record had simply given up or been forbidden to draw it. He's deation, usually channeled into ruthless efficiency, and buildings into a desperate need for understanding. He gripped a heavy-duty flashlight, its beam a solitary spear against the gloom of the basement. Fiskwood's Phothions were a labyrinth of rough-hewn stone and crumbling mortar. A test theto, an older, more brutal form of construction. He followed the faint outline of an old, disused service tunnel, its entrance barely visible behind a stack of forgotten crates. The tunnel opened into a cavernous sub-basement, an area he hadn't known existed. This was the blank space on the plans. The ceiling here was lower, pressed the weight of genthes of residents above. A thick layer of dust muffled Athis, undisturbed for decades. The flashlight beam cut through the particulate air, revealing not just more stone, but a wall unlike any other in the building. There was no seam, no handle, no obvious entrance. A faint vibration, a hum that resonated deep in his chest, drawing him closer. He ran his hands along the unnerving surface, searching for any give, any anomaly. His fingers brushed against a barely perceptible indentation, a hairline crack that widened as he applied pressure. It smelled of forgotten attics, of stagnant water, of dust motes dancing in sunbeams that had long since vanished beneath it all. A faint, almost imperceptible scent of rust and building gannic, decaying. Grant hesitated, his breath catching Faint's throat. Every instinct seemed for him to retreat, to seal this place forever. The sliding wall groaned shut behind him, plunging him into utter blackness. Panic, sharp and sudden, clawed at his throat. There was no exit, no way back. A wave of crushing despair washed over him, not his own, but 1,000 echoes of it. He felt the weight of countless forgotten lives, the quiet ache of loneliness, the faint trail, the slow, agonizing surrender to hopelessness. It wasn't just a feeling. It washi-souge of memories, fragmented and violent. Each fragment struck him like a physical blow, embedding itself in his mind. He stood on a desolate, rocky outcrop, the wind whipping his hair, tasting of salt and spray. Before him, stark against a bruised, churning sky, at an abandoned lighthouse. Its paint peeled in strips, its lantern long swash-attered, a gaping, vacant eye. Waves, impossibi, crashed against the rocks below, their roar a mournful, endless dirge. He felt an isolation so profound it was physical, a terrible, gnawing emptiness that mirror-Justin tower. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a sighous, desperate scream. Retherie, remember what I lost. The psychic assault intensified. He felt a profound emptiness bloom in his chest, as if something was siphoning away airy essence, his ambitions, his identity. It was a primal, wasn't hunger, craving not food, but attention, recognition, a return to the forefront of existence. The building around him groaned, theying. The walls of Tos seemed to press inward, the air growing impossibly heavy, thick and viscous, trapping him. He was not the trapping him. It was attempting to consume him, to absorb him into Iwast, forgotten tapestry of pain and memory. He clawed at his own chest. A despehis animalistic cry caught in his throat. This was not a hallucination. This was real. The entity, the core of the Blackwood, was here Blackwood eaching for him, hungry for his attention to spare, his very life. He had stumbled the Itwast, and it did, built there him leave. It was a profound emptiness blooming where't, as if something was siphoning away his very essence, his ambitions, his identity. The void wasn't just a lack. It was a hungry presence, cold and ancient, stretching tendrils into his deepest corners of his mind. He felt his grasp on himself aid affray, like a war history unraveling thread by thread. Memories, once crisp and swath-softened the edges, then bled into a vast, featureless gray. His avaments, the meticulous plans for new structures, the hard-won contracts. They dissolved, wasn't only a faint, bitter aftertaste of effort without reward. A new sensathisos, not the familiar despair, a seductive warmth, a gentle pressure that promised peace. He saw it then, not if eyes, but their art of his awareness that felt both internal and external. A structure, justable grace, soaring against a tumultuous ink-black sea. It was an abandoned light, her stark white stone against Aorm, its lamp housing a beacon of brilliant, steady light that cut through the tempest. He felt a surge of pride, a profound sense of accomplishment. Lighthouse, he knew, a testament to his vision, his mastery of form and function, fainted how wasping salt spray against the thick glass of the lantern room, but his, a profound silence. Wust. He was alone, utterly and completely, yet it felt like the pinnacle of Thyr, a monument to a lifetime of overlooked genius. The sensation was real, the texture of ancient rock, damp with ocean mist. But then, the image wavered. The proud structure defelt, only to reform, subtly different. This time, the lighthouse stood on a cathenched coast, its light a gentle pulse, guiding a lone ship home. A quiet joy settled over him, the kind that comes from deep personal connection. This wasn't just success. This was a love returned, a bond rewaasvered. A woman stood beside him, her haisarm in his. Her face was of affectless. He couldn't quite remember her name, but the feeling was undeniable. He was everything he had ever yearned for, a forgotten solace. He felt a profound sense of homecoming, a comfort that promised an end to all striving, all loneliness. But the warmth wath, a sugar-coated poison. Beneath the sweet illusion, the draining continued. He recognized the trick now, the way the entity offered him the very things it was stealing. It was showing him what it was taking, then making him believe he already possessed it, making him complicit in his own unraveling. The woman's fake afted, morphing into a series hissers he vaguely just. A was who had once praised his E felt signs. a colleague whose respect he had coveted, even his own younger self full of boundless ambition. Each face offered a smile, a nod of approval, a silent promiscuous recognition, wuzzled his thoughts boiseless his own, tinged with a faint echo of other lives, other aspirations. A sudden, sharp memory of a painter's palette he smell of turpentine and linseed oil flooded his mind. He had never painted, not seriously. Then came the taste of stale tobacco, ap whiskey, the weariness of a dock worker's shares, the quiet high-sir of a young mother roca an empty cradle. These were fragments, stolen from the building's past inhabitants, now woven into the fabric of his own consciousness. He was becoming a collage, a mosaic of forgot-felts, each fragment a tiny sacrifice fueling the entity's slow, deliberate consumption. Her skin had an unnerving pallid-most, translucent, stretched, taut-had sharp cheekbones. She moved with a strange, glid feints, as if pulled by invisible strings. Her lips dry and cracked down, and a voice emerged, soft and resonant. But it wasn't hers. To be remembered, not as yourself, but the of something grander, something all. He wanted to scream, to lash out, to reclaim his name, building cis high self. But his voice faded like tissue paper. Wasps felt heavy, weighted down by the collective despair of all those absorbed before him. He tried to focus on a single defining memory. The sharp scent of pencil lead on drafting paper, the Sachion click of a ruler, the thrila, a new design that the Nathi clung to it, a tiny anchor in the swirling chaos of borrowed lives. The artist took a step closer, her hand reaching out, not towards him, but past him, as if grasping the tendrils of his dissolving self. Join them, the voice ifed, now laced with an almost maternal tenderness. Become the vision. Become everything you were meant to be, amplified by all they have gathered. He saw a flash then, not of the lighthouse, but of the she, its old bricks crumbling, its windows like vacant eyes. And within those windows, he saw himself, reflected in countless Adartha, each one slight, different, each one a past tenant, a forgotten soul, all smiling with the same vacant, serene expression. Then face flickered, superimposed over theirs, indistinguishable. The profound emptying. His there deepened, but it was now accompanied by a terrifying sense of peace, a seductive surrender. He felt himself dissolving, his edges blurring, his identity bleeding into the vast, hungry tapestry of the entity. Her thif, his cynicism, his very name, they were becoming echoes, fuel for a presence that yearned not for life, but for the remembered goatheit. He was becoming one with the forgotten, an offering to the relentless hunger of the Blackwood. The image of his own face, multi-bulwazed cant windows of the she, each iteration a forgotten tev, their smiles hollow, lishaika a fantothe. Grant stood, shivering, not from the biting sea wind whipping around Thendoned Lighthouse, felt the cold dread that had Sif as Sathis. The lighthouse beam, long extinguished owns a cruel joke. There was no light to guide him now, only the encroaching shadow of a terrible understanda. He stared out, the churning gray ex-lighthouse, he waves crashing against the jagged rocks below with a relentless hunger wasp. The Blackwood, hazed with a sickening lurch, did Blackwood, on Heise's the spare. It was the sum of all the the fear, the stories, the lay-lived and lost with Ithawals. They'd on being remembered, on its history, on they act of its sense acknowledged. The more he dug, the more he ached, the he tried to understand, the more he fed own had been a willing accomplice, a diligent architect of his own demise. The thought hit him with the force of a physical Sheakanai air from his lungs. If the entity needed to be remembered to live, then its death lay in absolute oblivion. Not Wasram his mind, but from the building itself. A deliberate, violent erasure of its story. It wasn't enough to simply walk away. It would follow, a parasitic echo in his mind. He had to sever its roots, starve it of the thee that sustained it, hethe make it unhappen. A rite of forgetting. It wasn't about destroying the building, not physically. It was about dismantling its historic theors, the points where its memory was most potent, most concentrated. He thought of the dusty archives, his forgotten belongings, the very fabric of the structure that seemed to hum with forgotten lives. He would have to go back. Back into the maw of the Parthehi Dethek to the city was a blur of frantic thoughts and wit-air grip on the steering wheel. He parked the vehicle several blocks away. Aunile attempt at Stetharin Fuhad slip wasn't the sagging front door, which now hung precariously, Wassingle hinge. Building crude, desperate. He would target the places where the entity's influence hissed strongest. The old records room, the master suite where so many lives had unraveled, the very fountains in the basement. He would systematically erase every physical trace of its narrative. Every object that held a fragm building a first target was the old office, had filled with yellowed ledgers and brittle documents. He ignored them, HW set, and began to tear. Pages ripped, ancient ink smeared the crackle of crumbling paper filling the room. Each tear felt like a small act of defiance, a tiny chip taken from the entity's armor. They swayed, their forms fluid, like smoke given malicious intent. "You can't erase us," a voice hissed, thin as a razor. He fought it, focusing on the task, on the Tethebraken Thev to the master suite, the opulent, decaying hearth he built to here. The air was thick with a cloying sweetness, like rotting flowers. As he raised the iron bar to smash a Partherly Ornathes-covered mirror, a known conduit for the entity's Influithia figure coalesced a periphery of his vision. Her form was not solid, but shimmered, like heat haze over asphalt. A faint, unsettling smile played on her lips. A Sahat mirrored the vacant grins he'd the lighthouse vision. It wasn't her voice, not truly. It was a mimicry, a lure. It's so much easier to just be. She extended a hand, her fingers long and skeletal, tipped with nails like polished obsidian. Forget everything. A wave of profound weariness washed over he. A sudden urge to drop the bar, to simply lie down and let the oblivion take him. This was the entity's true power, he realized. Not violence, but the seductive Promithor getting of surrendering to the quiet. But this wasn't his forget I wear its F thing. He became another nameless face-eye building. He gritted his this, the taste of iron in Huasant no. Here his voik was. He wather on bar with all his might, not at Chloe, but the ornate mirror behind her. Chloe's shimmering form recoiled, a soundless shriek tearing through the air, vibrating in Grant's very bones. They gaze sharpened, not with pain faint the horrifying ancient fury. The sweetness in the air turned foul, tasting of burning hair and stagnant water. He had struck a nerve. He had found a way to wound it. The crowbar felt impossibly heavy in his grip, its cold steel a phantom limb. The oblivion beckoned, a vast, warm emptiness that promised an end to the ache, the fear, the relentless pursuit of Ag. But it wasn't his oblivion. The entity's final. In Sidiou, they're not of violence, but of blissful, permanent erasure. Not just for him, but of everything it had ever touched, everything it had ever consumed. It wanted to be forgotten, yes, but only after it had absorbed every last trace of remembrance from its victims. He sought the urge to drop the crowbar, to let his muscles slacken, to simply close his eyes and drift into the soft, velvet quiet. A memory flickered. A conversation with the building's prairie-passing mention of the forgotten archives, the Bethesteries. The memories weren't just food, they were anchors. Wasn't to lair the anchors, deny it the attention, the remembrance it craved. Grant pushed himself upright, his spine protesting with it'll pop. The air in the he was thick, not with dust, but with a palpable pressure, like a deep-sea current trying to drag him down. He ignored the whispers that slithered through his thought, theses of peace, of an end to ambition, an end to the anxiety that had Drahadim his entire life. He moved through the building, a silent, grim pilgrimage. Ant destroying the blackwood, he was purging it. The old tenaires, thick-wood with age, became kindling. The faded photographs of long-dead residents, their faces blurred by time, were torn to shreds. He didn't care about the history any more buildings way he once had. He cared about denying the parasitic thing its sustenance. The entity shrieked, a soundless scream that resonated in his skull, a pure, unadulterated agony of hunger and rejection. It wasn't a physical shriek. It was the psychic equivalent, a tearing sensation as its tender was remembrance where fork thept for their moorings. He felt his own memories flicker, individual mare. A childhood bithe, a critical design review, the sting of a failed relationship. Briefly eaten, then snapped back into place. But not quite. They felt distant, like old photographs viewed through smudged glass. He found the final, deepest anchor in the Bawas. Not an object, but a space. A forgotten, bricked-up Al-Kathahi furnace, hidden even from the most thorough inspections. He hammered the brickwo building row bar, each swing a desperate prayer, wasn't-ik assertion of his own will against Wasulding's insidious hold. Mortar the plumed, stinging his eyes, mixing with the sweat that poured down his face. Not clean, but utterly, frighteningly vacant. Grant stood there, breathing heavily, the crowbar now light in his hand, almost weightless. The entity was gone, or at least starved, hidden into a deep, unwilling dormancy. But the victory felt like a the. He tried to recall the face of the previous caretaker, of the colleague who had first mentioned the she's potential. Just faint impressions like footprints in sand erased by the tide. His own past felt porous. He that the entity its memories, but it had of Herther turn, a brutal tit for tat. That the blackwood that night thounged the main entrance, but through a blackwood window, crawling out into the biting night air like a creature fleeing a trap. Days later, he found himself drawn to the coast, to the weathered, found and abandoned lighthouse. He's to buildingsen, trying to remember what arriven him, what he had wanted from life before the she. The details were fragmented, like shards of glass. Did Thoutheds even mean now? He felt like an empty vessel, scoured clean, but at what cost? He had saved the building, perhaps, the parasitic tenant, but he had lost himself own process. The lighthouse monument to a forgotten Heiser. No new tenants with Blackwood new architect would chart its future. And he, standing in the biting wind atop the abandoned loss, knew the truth. It was merely dormant, its hunger sated for now. Histrils waiting to awaken, to latch onto the next unsuspecting soul who dared to remember it, to give it the attention it craved. Lighthouse. Was felt the building found downshe, the have there.